Hi, dear friends, this is Bob Hatton. This is the Encourager. And we're going to continue with our story as we saw yesterday that we have a problem that Moses cannot enter into the presence of God. And we can't get into the presence of God. But God has got a prescribed way. God has thought out a way of how people can come and meet with him. This tabernacle, it was also called the tent of meeting. And we saw that right at the beginning of Leviticus, the first verse, it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses out of the tabernacle, out of the tent of meeting," telling us that God is inside and Moses is outside, and Moses can't get into the presence of God. So we start the book of Leviticus with a problem, but God gives us the solution. God shows us the way into his presence. This is his prescribed way. This is not our way, and I must admit that I would have never thought of this, and I would probably have wanted to go another way. But anyway, he gives us 3 steps to get into his presence, 3 steps that are each divided into 2. I'll tell you where you can find these, and I imagine that there's quite a lot of numbers and Bible references that I'm mentioning, and because I'm going very quickly, you won't be able to follow. So just listen it, and if you want to, then you can read the information that I'm putting in this clip, and all these Bible references will be mentioned there, so you can have a look. So don't worry if you think I'm going too fast. Just listen. Well, first of all, God begins and he says you've got to do some rituals. And he tells us about these first rituals in chapter 1 to chapter 7. And then some other stuff comes, and then he comes back to the rituals, and in chapter 23 to 25, he continues talking about the rituals. Then from chapter 8 to chapter 10, he talks about the priests. Then other stuff comes, and then from chapter 21 to chapter 23, chapter 21 to 22, he talks about the priests once more. And finally, from the chapter 11 to 15, he talks about purity, and then continues this after a break again from verse 18 to verse 20. He talks about purity. So we have the rituals, we have the priests, and we have the thing about purity. So let's just dive in, and I'll try to explain a few of these things. Now, when he begins and talks about rituals, what he actually means is that we are to bring sacrifice to the Lord. And he talks about 5 different types of sacrifice. 3 of them are blood sacrifices, and we bring the blood sacrifices really to say, God, we're sorry for things that we have done. And it's by the death of an animal, by life being taken, our sin, our guilt can be taken away from us. And the 2 other offerings, they're not blood offerings, but they're to come to say thank you very much to God for what he has done for us. After the break, he comes back later and he talks about the festivals that Israel is supposed to celebrate. Every year there's annual festivals that they are supposed to celebrate. And by doing this, I mean, a festival is a very joyful time. They're thinking back about what God has done in the midst of the people. They celebrate the Passover, remembering how God brought them out of Egypt. They celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles to remember how that God brought them through the desert. And there's other festivals that they sacrifice to remember what God has done. And this gives them a sense of identity. They are the people of God. Now, in the next section, it's about the priests. And we know that Israel is to be a nation, is to be a kingdom of priests. That is, they are to represent God before the other peoples of this world, and they will represent the other peoples of the world to God. But then there's a group of people within the people of Israel who are going to be priests for Israel. And the first high priest, the boss priest, the chief priest, that's Aaron. That's Moses' elder brother. He becomes the first chief priest, and his sons are also priests. And then from then onwards, it's his descendants, people who are out of the family of Aaron, the descendants of Aaron, the men, they become the priests. And Aaron comes from the tribe of Levi, like his brother Moses. So this is a special tribe. They are to represent Israel before God and to represent God before Israel. When we go to the chapters 21 to 22, we're told about the qualifications that these priests must have, and I suppose it's something that they needed to aspire to, that they are morally clean and people of integrity and so on, and that they are not to come glibly into the presence of God. Now, Aaron had two sons, and they came into the presence of God without thinking about anything, and God struck them dead. So it's a very serious thing, being a priest and coming into God's presence. The last section is about purity, and we all become impure now and again, and impure doesn't mean that we have done anything wrong, but it's just a normal course of everyday life. And it's more or less, there's a lot of stuff in there about death. If you touch a dead body, then you become impure. If you have certain skin diseases, if you're in a house where the mold is, you've become ritually impure. Now, this doesn't mean that we're finished and there's no hope for us. There are certain things that you had to do, and you had to wait a certain time. And I think this is to show us that God is a God of life, and death doesn't have anything to do with him. Death is his enemy, and so we can't come into the presence of God if we have anything to do with death. But we can get rid of it, and of course, death belongs to life. That's just a fact of life and how life is today. But then in the second section, he talks about our moral purity, and he says, for instance, that we are to care for the poor. This is something that is very close to the heart of God, that we are to look after the people who are disadvantaged. And he tells us that we are to live sexually lives of sexual integrity. And also that we have to practice social justice and make sure that in the place where we live, round about us, there is no injustice taking place. Now, in the middle is all this action, all these things I speak in. I know sometimes reading the book of Leviticus can be a little bit monotonous, but if we try to keep this big picture, I think you'll find it very inspiring. And in the chapters 16 and 17 is from the passage on the festivals. He talks this like a high point. This is like the summit, the climax of this book. He talks about the Day of Atonement, and he says on the Day of Atonement, the high priest must take 2 goats. And one goat is sacrificed in the altar, it's killed on the altar, its blood is spilt for the sins of the whole people. And then after that, he takes the other goat, he lays his hands on the goat, and he transmits the sins and the guilt of the people onto this goat, and this goat is then sent off into the wilderness. The goat is called the scapegoat. That's where we get this word. It's loaded with our sins and our guilt, and it takes them away. And that's like showing us that this sin has to be taken away out of the camp. And it's something that is very dramatic, and later we can see all these things. They're just shadows. They're all pointing to Jesus. Now, At the end of the book of Leviticus, Moses has a speech and he tells the people that if they obey God, if they live in obedience, then the result will be prosperity, abundance, and peace. But if they are unfaithful, that will result in disaster, and they could even be exiled from the promised land that God is now taking them into. So he's telling them to be careful how you live. Well, does this work? Well, we go to the next book. The next book is the book of Numbers, and it begins. You remember how Leviticus began? It said that, and God spoke to Moses from out of the tabernacle, from out of the tent of meeting. God was inside, Moses was outside. Well, the book of Numbers starts with the words, and God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. So the beginning of Leviticus is outside, in the beginning of Numbers is inside. It works, it functions, this way of getting into the presence of God. And I hope and I wish you all that you come into God's presence and you enjoy his fellowship. So God bless you. See you again. You're Bob Hatton, your encourager.